Hey, it's Josiah. On today's episode, I was joined by returning guest Keanu Heydari to discuss the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran we've seen over the last week or so. For those who aren't familiar, Keanu is a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan, studying the history of modern Europe and the Middle East. His research looks at the politics of the Iranian diaspora, specifically students who migrated to France after the 1953 coup. In general, Keanu is an incredibly thoughtful guy with a lot of knowledge regarding history and geopolitics related to the Middle East. He's been on the show a few times now to discuss Israel's war in Gaza. As always, he was incredibly insightful on this episode, and I hope you enjoy it. But before we get on with the episode, I do need to say that you can support this show on Patreon. For $3 a month, you get access to additional bonus episodes, as well as the occasional deleted scene from a main feed episode, and access to the Fruitless Discord. If you're not quite ready to support the show financially, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps people find the show, and I might read your review at the top of an episode. All right, with that out of the way, let's get on with the episode. You are listening to Fruitless, a podcast hosted by me, Josiah Sun. This is episode 65, Iran and the Logic of Escalation, featuring Keanu Heydari. All right, well, welcome everybody to another exciting episode of Fruitless. I am joined by friend of the show. You haven't been here in a while, but it's good to have you back, Keanu Heydari. Hello, Keanu.
Hey, Josiah, it's great to be here. As you said, my name is Keanu Heydari. I am finishing up my PhD in history at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. What the future holds, I have no idea, but we'll see about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, specifically, your PhD topic was the Iranian diaspora. Is that correct?
That's right. I look at the history of Iranian student activism abroad, mostly in France, from 1945 up until the revolution in 1979. And I think that's important to think through because a lot of our discourse in the present moment is really fixated on the idea of this irrational rogue revolutionary actor state, the state of Iran. And I think zooming out a little bit and looking at the sort of prehistory that gives us more context of, the political possibilities in the Iranian political imagination, it gives us pause and it helps us ask better questions.
Yeah, so that's, I wish I'd bring you on the show for more cheerier reasons. I feel every time I do bring you on, it's like, oh shit, something horrible is happening in the news.
Right. Yeah. It's very unfortunate.
And yes, as I'll probably say at the beginning of this, like we are recording this Wednesday around noon, June 18th. Things are moving fast. I've had like the Al Jazeera live reporting just going constantly, and it's new stuff is constantly happening. So some stuff we say might be outdated, but I think historical context is going to be historical context regardless. So, what's going on with Israel and Iran?
Yeah. So, I think the first thing we need to do is just to state the truth. What's going on right now is not a proxy war anymore. What we're watching is a direct, open military confrontation between two of the most entrenched and ideologically opposed states in the Middle East, of course, Israel and Iran. So how did this all start? On June 13th, Israeli Prime Minister ordered a sustained aerial assault on Iranian targets. According to Agence France Presse, which is reporting from June 15th, strikes hit military command centers, missile sites, key energy infrastructure in cities like Tehran, Kermanshah, and Mashhad. And based on that report, we have over 224 people killed with more than 1,000 wounded. And this is just the beginning. Obviously, this is still a developing situation. And unfortunately, I really only expect these figures to increase in number. Iran responded within hours. Missiles were launched at Tel Aviv, Haifa, and nearby suburbs. The same reporting from Agence France-Presse has told us that 18 Israelis were killed and hundreds more were injured. Then came the statement that crystallized this logic of escalation. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz declared the inhabitants of Tehran will pay the price. And I don't think that was a slip of the tongue. It was a declaration of intent. It marked a sharp departure from the already blurred line between military targeting and collective punishment.
Yeah, I mean, that's just straight up saying we are going to target civilians. Civilians are, who we're taking this out on.
I think in order to really understand how we got here, though, I think what we have to do is go beyond the surface, to go beyond this immediate escalation, and try to at least get the spark notes for the longer arc of the relationship between Israel and Iran. I think the reason why we need to do that is because, contrary to popular belief, Israel and Iran were not always enemies. In fact, prior to the revolution in 1979, Israel and the Shah enjoyed a close but largely covert strategic partnership.
Oh, interesting.
Exactly. The Shah's Iran was one of only two Muslim majority countries to recognize Israel de facto.
Okay.
You know what the other one was?
I don't.
It was Turkey.
Oh.
So Iran and Israel cooperated on oil exports and arms sales and intelligence sharing and regional containment strategies. Containment being our great euphemism to talk about the threat of communism, right?
Right.
And they cooperated particularly against Arab nationalist regimes like Nasser's Egypt or Ba'athist Iraq. Iran gave Israel oil, and Israel provided Iran with technical expertise and military reconnaissance. And the alliance made sense because both countries were, at least they felt, encircled by hostile neighbors, and both Israel and Iran were cornerstones of the U.S.-backed regional order in the Cold War Middle East.
Right. They're both the anti-communist forces in the Middle East, right?
Exactly. And all of this changes in 1979. When the Islamic Revolution happens and Ayatollah Khomeini comes in power, Tehran's foreign policy was basically built up from the bottom, from scratch.
Right.
And Khomeini severed ties with Israel immediately. And he called it the Little Satan, infamously, suggesting that Israel is a client of American imperialism and an oppressor of Muslims the world over.
Right.
So Iran's support for Palestinian liberation becomes this foundational component of its post-revolutionary identity. And over the following decades, Iran starts to back armed groups like Hezbollah and more recently Hamas, and positioning itself really as the primary challenger to Israeli regional influence. And I would say in closing, that much of the conflict since the 2000s has really played out indirectly. In places like Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, cyber attacks, the direct military conflict between Iran and Israel really remained largely off the table.
It's been a kind of regional Cold War up until this moment here. So what is everyday life looking like in Tehran right now? What is Iran like right now?
Yeah. So French publication Mediapart, a really good source of news if any of your listeners read French. An article from them by Rashida El Azouzi, which came out on June 16th, gives us a really sobering portrait of what's going on the ground. I want to share with you the voice of one person she interviewed, a young man named Ali. He lives between Paris and Tehran. And since the Israeli strikes began, he says he hasn't been able to sleep. His nights are spent glued to the TV, to his phone, watching for news, calling his family, refreshing his social media, and hoping to hear a word from his sister. He says that his relatives have fled Tehran and are trying to reach Turkey. And for now, at least what we know from the article, they're alive, but that's about all he knows. His father is 90 years old. He lived through World War II and then through the Iran-Iraq war, and now this.
Oh, my God.
Ali told Mediapart that, quote, "We're living through a nightmare no one was prepared for." He also points out something that should give us pause, probably. The Iranian state has deliberately slowed the internet in the country. It doesn't want people sharing videos of buildings on fire and people splayed out on the street.
Right.
The regime doesn't want the outside world to see what's happening. And meanwhile, people who criticize the regime even quietly risk being accused of spying. So thousands of people are trying to flee Tehran. The roads north toward the Caspian Sea are jammed, or I should say they were jammed. I've heard reports now saying that Tehran is like a ghost town. Very eerie environment.
Oh,
And
man.
there's hardly any gas available. What little you're able to find is rationed. You're able to pump 20 liters into your tank. And with 20 liters from central Tehran, that's not enough to get very far. And the question is posed, if you could leave, where would you go?
Well, and especially with, I mean, you know, domestically we're seeing with the U.S. and then, of course, this has been the case in Europe, this anti-immigrant fervor that's really hitting more and more of a fever pitch right now. Like, where is there to go?
While these bombs are falling, Josiah, the Iranian regime is doing what it knows how to do best, which is to crack down. The Basij militia has been intensifying arrests. If reports are meant to be taken at face value, in Iranian culture and society, it's considered bourgeois and disrespectful to have a dog inside your house. And so people are being fined now for walking their dogs in public. I don't have very much hard data to prove that point, but it's an observation I've seen come across over and over over the past few days. More importantly, at least dozens of people have been detained under suspicion of links to Israel. And this is a claim that Iranian authorities have been making, particularly during the women life freedom protests. So these aren't new tactics, right?
Right. And, okay, so with the slowing down the internet and stuff like that, what is the fear from Iran of having videos of the destruction go out? Because, from of course, my just perspective of what I've seen a lot of the horrific videos that we've seen come out of Palestine have been a source of like sympathy for Gaza and for the Palestinian struggle. Do they not think that would be the same case with Iran, or?
This is a point that I think we should broach in probably some substantial depth, because why is it that they're trying to limit internet reach? A report came out, I believe, at this point yesterday, and for your listeners, I apologize for the shifting timelines because we're just getting this news and processing it like everybody else, right?
Right. Yeah.
But Iran has asked everyone in the country to delete Instagram and WhatsApp from their phones. And the justification that the regime is using for this is that Israel is using somehow geolocation data to find and target particular individuals. This might be, a kind of hysterical overstatement, but the reality on the ground is that the regime does not want people to see the kind of destruction that Israel is unleashing on the country. I'm sure there are pressing security concerns that we're not going to be privy to, but why wouldn't they? I think part of it boils down to the fact that a lot of sympathy for Iran, especially in the Arab world, has been eroded.
Sure.
Especially from a top-down perspective. Iran's decision over the past 20 years to support groups like Hezbollah and Hamas has soured it in the opinions of a lot of the Gulf states.
Okay, yeah.
But it's important to emphasize that, unlike in Israel, there are not really any bomb shelters in Tehran. There are no systematic air raid systems or sirens. Iranians simply don't have the infrastructure that Israel citizens rely on. One person, a founder of the group We Are Iranian Students, in another Mediapart article, her name is Aida Tavakoli. She says the regime has done nothing to protect the civilian population of the country. According to her, it will periodically send out text messages vowing vengeance. Businesses will remain open and life will continue as normal because in Aida's opinion, the regime would just rather preserve the illusion of control than admit to the chaos that's actually unfolding.
Right. And the devastation could just come as showing the strength of Israel or something like that. So
Aida Tavakoli's testimony in the Mediapart article is worth circling back to. She has this line that I have been meditating on for the past few days, which is, how did we arrive at the idea? She asks. that bombing a people can liberate them.
Right. And yeah, this is something important to be emphasizing now because, while we've had this, conversations over the years about, your own criticisms of the Iranian regime. That does not mean, the U.S. will be welcomed as liberators, to echo previous attempts at regime change like this. So I think that's something important to underline is that, just because there are very valid criticisms of this regime does not mean that U.S. involvement will make this any better or Israeli involvement will make this any better for your average Iranian.
And what we're getting from all this on the ground testimony from Ali and Ida and from the many other voices that we're not going to hear from, right? It's not just fear or exhaustion. In my reading, what's going on is actually a pretty sorrowful clarity of the stakes of the situation, which is Iranian citizens know that they're pawns in someone else's game, and they know that their pain is being used. Right. In this case, primarily by Israel, but also by the regime and by the Western media at large. The thing I want to just emphasize is that the people are still there. Right. They're calling their families. They're refusing to, settle for this as the new status quo. And I think that's where we have to really begin, not with a question of strategy or deterrence, but with the ordinary people under the bombs, right? Who are trying to stay alive in a city that's becoming unrecognizable.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of ink, has been spilled and will continue to be spilled about U.S. involvement and U.S. diplomatic relations with this. And, of course, we'll be talking about that throughout this. But another, important aspect of this has been France's involvement and Europe kind of broadly's involvement. I also know that's a bit of an area of expertise for you. So why don't you tell me a little bit about what Macron how Macron has been involved in all this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in order to talk about geopolitically what's going on, we really need to spend some time talking about the role of France, right? Specifically, we need to talk about what Emmanuel Macron, the French president, did and did not do when Israel began to start bombing Iran. You might remember that before this escalation, Macron was set to co-host a major international conference in New York. The aim was to build diplomatic support for recognizing a Palestinian state. So France, Saudi Arabia, and several other actors were planning to take this high-profile step that would have signaled a real shift in the global alignment on the Palestinian question. And then, as we know, June 13th happened. Israeli missiles struck Iranian soil, and Macron blinked. The conference that was to be held in New York was postponed indefinitely. And Macron, who had previously styled himself as a kind of mediator, he was going to be a voice for reason in Middle Eastern diplomacy. He abandoned that posture almost immediately, right? In fact, at a press conference, he declared, Israel has the right to live free from the threat of annihilation. Now, of course, every state has the right to security. Right. But that's not all that Macron said, right? I think Macron's message was crystal clear at this critical junction. France is standing with Israel, and there was no mention of proportionality. There was no mention of who struck whom first. There was no call for restraint of any kind. And perhaps the most indicting of all, there was no reference to the genocide of the Palestinian people who are reeling from months of Israeli attacks in Gaza. So what is this? This is a political realignment, right? A journalist in Mediapart who wrote an article on June 16th, Il Ramdani, argues that Macron's pivot is a pretty substantial break with France's traditional approach to the region.
Yeah, they've been more balanced, right?
They've been more balanced, right?
Both sidesing it and stuff, yeah.
Precisely. And that's key because French diplomacy under both conservative and socialist governments has always tried to strike some kind of balance, not always successfully, but on paper at least. France is supposed to be the counterweight to the United States' uncritical support for Israel.
Right. That's why the U.S. was so mad at them during the Iraq War era as well, right? It was similar.
Exactly. So all told, what we're seeing right now is not France as an independent actor, but as a junior partner in what we can now see is a broader Atlanticist bloc. This is a France that, at least as far as its foreign policy goes, is going to echo the old Bush era neoconservative script, which reiterates tirelessly again and again that Israel is a quote unquote democracy, Iran is a quote unquote rogue state. And any kind of challenge to that binary is a kind of, almost epistemic betrayal. And that's something we can get into more about the Palestine question and how it's so troubling for the overarching logic of Western civilization, right? All that to say, this is not a diplomatic inconvenience, right? To delay this conference in the midst of the end stages of a genocide is a devastating signal to civil rights globally, human rights globally, right? To anyone who has any shred of attachment to the idea that diplomacy still matters. Macron has shown that when push comes to shove, even a nuclear crisis can serve as a cover to sideline the aspirations of the Palestinian people.
Jeez. Well, I guess this moves us naturally to the question. I mean, if now we're talking in this international terms about diplomacy, a lot of this diplomacy is, of course, related to oil markets, to energy markets. I think it was in light of the attacks and Trump leaving the G7 talks that Ursula von der Leyen, had said the G7 reiterates its commitment to peace and stability in the Middle East. And then at the very end adds, we remain vigilant on the implications on energy markets. So this is very crucial to the international response here.
If we want to step back and look at the bigger economic picture that is going on right now, in the midst of bombs falling, people dying, missiles flying, right?
Right.
What's strange in this whole affair is that global oil markets have barely flinched.
Interesting.
Now, I don't want to eat my hat here, right? What could happen? I mean, if the shit hits the fan and we enter into a crisis of unmitigated proportions, Iran is going to set mines in the Strait of Hormuz and destroy the entire global oil supply, right? But this is a threat level midnight unlikely scenario. We'll see what happens, right? But for the time being, it's kind of surprising that oil markets haven't really moved,
right?
Because there's a freaking war going on. So what's happening is that critical infrastructure is being destroyed. Civilians are evacuating major cities. But the Financial Times says that this Brent crude, which is the global oil benchmark, it rose by just over 5% when the conflict began and then dropped slightly afterwards. As of our conversation right now, prices are settling around $72 a barrel, and markets were not panicking. If anything, they were betting on restraint. I think it's because of the Strait of Hormuz, which I mentioned earlier. So some figures say we have about 21 million barrels of oil, which is 1/3 of all seaborne oil in the world, passes through that single strait every day.
Right.
It's the lifeline that's connecting the Gulf states, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to the global energy ecology. And nobody has touched it yet. I don't think that's an accident. So in the Financial Times, an expert from an energy firm, Kepler, Homayoun Felkashi, has said that Israel is avoiding hitting Iran's most crucial export terminal on Kharg Island, which handled 90% of the country's oil exports.
Right.
Iran hasn't even tried to close the strait, even though it has the capacity to do so. And it threatens all the time to do this. If you want one example, think back to 2019 when Iran was accused of sabotaging tankers on the strait.
Right.
To go even further back to the Iran-Iraq war, both sides were targeting shipping in what became known as the tanker war.
Right.
So none of this has repeated itself yet. What we're seeing is restraint. And I think this matters because if something did happen, it would be a catastrophe of unmitigated proportions. Something else to keep in mind is that diplomacy plays a large role in these economic considerations.
Right.
Just in 2023, Iran restored ties with Saudi Arabia. And that's important because Iran is probably unlikely to risk thawing, to risk the thaw of relationships between Saudi Arabia and Iran by attacking Saudi infrastructure, which it did in 2019. At bottom, I think both sides are going to avoid direct hits on global energy supply lines. And there's a moral implication to all of this, right? It's that economic restraint and military escalation often coexist. And it's like almost a silent agreement at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
Iran and Israel appear willing to destroy parts of each other's infrastructure, kill as many civilians as they want, and intensify repression in both their respective governments, but no one wants to tip over the oil barrel.
Right. Does that, I mean, part of that, would that just be that, I mean, once you start fucking with the oil markets, that guarantees more and more international, intervention starting to take place.
This is what the extremist right-wing Iranian neo-monarchist diaspora cuts their teeth on, right? Mm-hmm. The conspiracy theory that the Shah was attempting to safeguard a larger percentage of Iranian oil and make it more, circulating within the Iranian economy. And it was that in the 1970s that led to his downfall. Obviously, this is not true, but any kind of touching Iran's natural resources gets weaponized right away, in some kind of memory politics. And I think this leads us into the question of memory politics, precisely leads us into talking about what I think most people came to this episode to listen to, which is about the nuclear dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, that's where we go from here, because that's where we get discussions of, the energy markets, but also the fears of, to bring back an old phrase, weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. So what do you make of the Iranian nuclear program? How much should people be scared of it, etc.?
So yeah, let's talk about the bomb, the big elephant in the room. So if you're going to listen to Israeli officials, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, you're going to hear one claim over and over again. Iran is building a nuclear weapon. That is the core ideological justification for this war. That's the threat Israel says it's preempting, but it's not true. I think there's lots of like gristle here for some critical theorist of memory politics, for some genius to write about this, to talk about how we're sincerely in a post-truth era.
Truly, yeah.
It does not matter that international agencies have, for the foreseeable past and future, have identified that Iran is not interested in a nuclear weapon, right? It doesn't matter. And I don't know what to do with that. As a historian, I rely on empirical evidence, right?
Yeah, you're generally interested in what's actually the case. So exactly. What do you do in a post-truth society? I don't know. This has been making me pull my hair. I'm not even super knowledgeable about, Iran. But this very basic fact has been very basically true for decades now. They are not building a bomb. And if they were, Israel has a lot of them.
To understand this whole situation, I think we have to rewind the clock back to 2012. It was that year when Netanyahu stood in front of the United Nations General Assembly holding a cartoon diagram of a bomb with a literal drawing of a red line across it with a marker, right? And it was dramatic. It was effective. Mm-hmm. He warned that Iran was just, quote unquote, months away from having the uranium needed for a bomb. And it's this refrain that I just want your listeners to think about. What does months away mean from 2012 to today? Today, what's going on is that Netanyahu is arguing that Iran has finally crossed that red line, that Iran is no longer just enriching uranium, but it's actively working to weaponize it.
Right.
So I get my news from, normally the Financial Times or Democracy Now!, and they seem to be two very completely opposed sources, but I don't trust the New York Times anymore, right? And what all these major outlets that I trust, Financial Times, Democracy Now!, have said is that U.S. intelligence and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, do not agree with Netanyahu's assessment. They say, both agencies, that there is no credible evidence that Iran is building a nuclear bomb at the moment. There is no confirmed program. There is no finalized weapons design. And perhaps most importantly, there is no warhead-ready delivery system. We have to be honest that Iran has come somewhat close. They've enriched uranium to 60%, which is technically just shy of weapons grade. Iranians also have enough of it. They have over 400 kilograms by some counts to build several bombs if they wanted to. But enrichment is really only a part of this process. From what I've gathered reading several experts, the technical leap from enriched uranium to a usable weapon involves a few things, right? It involves warhead design, explosive mechanisms, and a reliable missile delivery system, right? And that takes time. It takes engineering expertise and a political decision. As far as I know, that decision has not been made.
So we're there is at this point no evidence that they're anywhere near having a nuclear weapon. And, you know, something I consistently come back to is I'm not certain I understand I understand what the crisis of having nuclear weapons in the world is, the existential threat that is. I don't understand what Iran having like a nuke really is an existential threat, because it assumes that they're just going to irrationally bomb anyone, you know, without any stated foreign policy goal. With like, no one has been able to, for me, walk through why, outside of just appealing to a frankly racist assumption of just Iranian irrationality, they would just randomly nuke someone as soon as they got a nuke. I mean, this is just them having a nuke is unfortunate. Having a nuke is just how you do foreign policy now. Unfortunately, you know, I don't know. And that's not good, but I don't know.
So, I mean, like, in order it kind of sucks that it doesn't really matter what has happened. I feel bad as a historian saying that, right? I mean, like, your listeners probably know that in 2015, the JCPOA deal, the nuclear framework between the West and Iran, it collapsed when President Trump pulled out of it. Right. And that was in 2018.
Right.
So since 2018, Iran has ramped up its activity, but it's not because, in my reading, they're racing towards a bomb. It was because Trump killed the deal and sanctions kept on coming.
Right.
So Iran's enrichment strategy is a form of pressure, and it's a tactical signal that's trying to say we can go further if we need to. Here's why this is a clusterfuck of a problem. It's because all of this to say, until a few days ago, Iran remained under surveillance because what Netanyahu's logic is so flawed. It begins to unravel here because in the process of bombing Iran's nuclear facilities, Israel has not stopped a nuclear program. What have they stopped? They've disrupted international inspections.
Right.
The IAEA can no longer safely access sites like Natanz or Fordow. So even if you are a liberal, white supremacist, civilizational, Iran is inherently evil kind of person, this is a bad situation to be in, right? Yeah. Now, all that said, circling back to a point you made very well, yeah, it's clearly racist. It's clearly, it's clearly there is a discourse of state actor rationality here. And what has been going on since the post-war moment is, frankly, a libidinal, a psychological investment, a civilizational investment in the strategic welfare of Israel as a way to psychoanalytically divest the European conscience of its complicity in the Holocaust. Right. And that dynamic is not relevant in 2025, but it still shapes so much of the discourse in a way that is not transparently readable to most audiences. Most people would ask, well, what's wrong with Iran having a nuclear weapon if it is the case that having nuclear arms is an indication of a state's modernity?
Ability to negotiate on the global, scale. Yeah.
Exactly. The suggestion is that Iran is not a modern country, that there is somehow a belatedness in Iran's modernity. And this belatedness is directly responsible for the horrible state of affairs in the world. I don't know, whatever logic they want to use to justify that kind of racist perspective. Now, that's my left-wing academic, normal to be expected opinion. I think what people don't want to see is that even if you are opposed to Iran for some reason specifically having a nuclear weapon, what's going on right now is going to have very, very negative consequences for nuclear non-proliferation.
Because all this guarantees is that Iran needed a nuke to prevent this kind of attack. Not saying again, I'm not endorsing more nukes in the world. I wish we had none. But all this is just doing is going, they need a better bargaining chip than what they have. It is creating the circumstances for Iran to be even more incentivized to try to get a nuclear weapon.
Going off that point, what's most troubling to me is that, as I've been keeping my ear to the ground in terms of hearing what the official formal politics are in Iran versus what, let's say, educated bourgeois people who are university trained in Tehran versus people who are more middling classes, more religious, and then people who are poorer, there's a shift in the public opinion on the ground in Iran. Mm. What do I mean by that? Even the conservatives, the so-called hardliners, for decades had avoided publicly calling for nuclear weapons. There was a taboo in Iran because both Khomeini and now Khamenei were pretty adamant that Iran's nuclear program was peaceful in nature. Some Iranian officials are now saying, maybe we do need the bomb after all. And as you've pointed out, it's really not hard to imagine why, right? Because from their perspective, nuclear deterrence is what keeps countries safe from external aggression.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a lot of talk after the invasion of Ukraine that had Ukraine had a nuke, this wouldn't, they wouldn't have been invaded by Russia. I mean, this is just how foreign negotiations are happening now. And, and have happened since the Cold War.
I think the ultimate question that we have right now is not, does Iran want a bomb? Mm-hmm. The question is, why are we giving them a reason
to want a bomb?
To want a bomb.
Right.
And I think it's this ultimate act of cognitive dissonance that's going on that it really boils down to, in my very partisan reading, a distraction strategy by the Israeli government, by Netanyahu, and by most of the Israeli establishment to frankly divert attention to its genocide by creating these artificial states of exception,
right?
As Agamben has pointed out, right? These states of exception where crisis after crisis after crisis are combined and put into this bricolage, this assemblage, to ultimately confuse and overwhelm and demoralize people, to make it easier to rely on these inherited Cold War tropes about Iran as this irrational religious extremist actor and Israel as this benevolent, though, this benighted democracy in the Middle East. We all know that all of this is bullshit, but the narrative is still so salient. It's still so powerful. Mm-hmm. There's a plurality of routes we could take this conversation from. What's his name? Mike Huckabee's text message to Donald Trump, where he says something to the effect of, "This is God's plan. God saved you from getting murked at that campaign event so that you could enable Israel's genocide of Palestinians and allow for the destruction of Iran." Right? Yeah. This is where we're at right now in the discourse.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, the irony of talking about Iran as a religious fundamentalist, state acting purely off that. And then, of course, having our own politicians here in the U.S., making similar religious appeals to justify war crimes. Yeah, there's a lot of directions we can go here. I guess kind of returning here to Iranian, leadership here.
Where does Iran stand now?
What's going to happen? Right? Yeah, right. Yeah.
This really brings us to a kind of a complicated set of questions, right? And I don't want to overwhelm your listeners with too much, historical digression, but I think we really have to start with something that isn't always obvious from the outside, which is the question of memory. So the Islamic Republic of Iran was born out of the crucible of war. In 1980, just a year after the revolution, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. That war lasted 8 years, and it cost hundreds of thousands of lives. This war was a formative trauma for the regime. And back then, Iran was isolated, ideologically driven, and militarily unprepared. They fought, as one famous commander put it, with empty hands. Supplies were so scarce that they were begging friendly states for basic goods, things like barbed wire. right?
Right.
The war ended in 1988 when Ayatollah Khomeini, the guy who founded the republic, agreed to a UN-brokered ceasefire. Khomeini said that he felt it was drinking from a chalice of poison. In other words, it was necessary to do this, but it was very bitter, right? If you fast forward today, Iranian leadership is drawing from that same emotional playbook. Only this time, the regime is older, more institutionalized, but also more brittle. Ayatollah Khamenei, who is Khomeini's successor, right now he's 86 years old. He has ruled since 1989. And according to Chatham House, this may be the most serious test of his tenure. It's not 1980 anymore, in summary, right? The revolutionary zeal that powered the country through the war has gone. The country today is fractured. Its youth are disillusioned. The economy is seriously struggling. Most reports, BBC Persian, for example, has now said that somewhere around 30% of the country is living below the poverty line relative to what the poverty line is in Iran. Most Iranian people, especially younger ones, in some way feel alienated from the idea of an Islamic Republic, right?
Right.
But the security apparatus is what we have to focus on. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is not something that most Americans have familiarity with, right? Because it's a revolutionary vanguard organization. In many ways, in my classes, I've described it as what would happen if Robespierre got his wish and the Committee for Public Safety became an institutionalized feature of the French regime, right?
Right.
So unlike the Iranian military, which is meant to solve crises of whatever scale, the IRGC, its mandate is to defend the Iranian revolution. Despite public anger with the IRGC, with the regime, there's no alternative that's credible that's waiting in the wing, right? The opposition in exile, it lacks popular support, to put it very mildly. The internal reform movement has been effectively crushed, and nobody knows what's going to happen next. Because what that means is that even under intense external pressure and internal discontent, this regime could ostensibly survive into the foreseeable future. What does Iran know how to do? It knows how to adapt, absorb the hit, and project defiance. Part of that projection of defiance means showing a guarded restraint. Yes, of course, it's true that Iran has launched missiles at Israel, but as of today, it hasn't attacked U.S. bases in Iraq. It hasn't struck Saudi or Emirati oil fields. It still hasn't closed the Strait of Hormuz, which we talked about, right? If people are worried about a global conflict, that's what I would be looking at, right? Those would be the red lines. Once you cross those red lines, I don't see any alternative but a wider regional conflict, right? So far, Iran has not crossed that threshold. Some analysts in Iran are saying that Khamenei himself is trapped between two arguably impossible options. One of them is to make a deal with the US and completely give up the nuclear program, right? And that would look like capitulation and therefore reduce whatever degree of credibility his regime has. The second option is to keep resisting and risk further devastation of the country. Neither path is attractive, but from the regime's perspective, if it continues to resist in a tempered and strategic and symbolic way, that's probably the less humiliating option, right? Ironically, Iran sees this as a David and Goliath struggle.
Right, and not wanting to risk just, another poison chalice, right? Well, okay. So what does justice mean in this moment, right? What's the right answer? I mean, obviously we're asking complicated, we're talking about a pretty complicated situation here, and there isn't going to be an easy answer to this, but I guess where should the left position itself? And then what do we make of all this?
Let me just circle back to a question posed by the Iranian student activist that we talked about earlier, Aida Tavakoli. Her cousin was trapped in Tehran as the missiles fell. No bomb shelters, no sirens, just the sound of drones overhead and the windows left open so that the glass wouldn't shatter inside, right? And the pressing question is, how did we arrive at the idea that bombing a people can liberate them?
Right.
I think that's the line, right?
Yeah.
That's our line. which is not a question we're holding space for today, but always. We've heard this story time and time again. Whether it's in Iraq or in Libya or in Syria, we're told over and over again that military action is the necessary path to freedom. We're told that regimes can be dismantled with force. In the case of Iraq, Americans were promised that the people living under the regime would be grateful.
Right.
We have seen over and over again that bombs do not build democracies. Bombs break things, and they leave behind power vacuums and civilian casualties and trauma and rubble. I think what we have to do is say this clearly without any kind of prevarication, is that Israel's justification for this war rests on a fragile and dangerous narrative. There's no evidence that Iran is currently building a nuclear weapon. In fact, what Israeli strikes have done is make IAEA monitoring almost impossible, harder to verify anything. We know less now than we did a month ago. Instead of preventing nuclear proliferation, this war is going to fuel it. And on the other side of this whole thing, we have the Iranian regime, which remains repressive, it remains unaccountable, and perfectly willing to let its own people suffer. The civilians, as always, are going to be the ones, have been the ones who are paying the price for this. And they're doing so in a world that's calibrated really not to notice their suffering. As we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Right. The markets are calm. Nobody cares.
Yep.
As long as the missiles stay localized, the world will keep moving. To answer your question, Josiah, I think justice in this case, it's going to sound pretty boring and bland and just kind of generic liberal, right? But I think we need to really insist on the value of civilian life.
Yeah.
We need to have a conversation about what would it mean to ethically refuse seeing human beings as collateral.
Something that I think the left is already in a position to go because of Gaza. This is the thing that those who have organized on the left over the last couple of years have been saying. This is the thing that is being fought consistently in the broader discourse in the US is we do not want to have the blood of civilians on our hands. And I think that rhetorically at least is a very important thing to continue to push as, US involvement seems more and more inevitable. That those of us living within the metropole, within the center, the core of the empire, need to be saying that we do not want another, we don't want more civilian blood on our hands. We have millions of deaths on our hands from Iraq. We have, a number we probably don't know yet for Palestine. The numbers just kind of stopped at a certain point. We don't know. And enough is enough.
That's really all I had for the content. I think, what would be interesting is, do you have any particular questions for me?
No, I mean, this is great. I think just, this final chunk here, just kind of, we're kind of what we're saying here, but what the left ought to be doing. Do you have any, notions of what left-wing organizations should be mobilizing on right now?
From my very small vantage point, as, a historian in Ann Arbor, looking at what various, mainline Protestant churches have done to, send statements of solidarity with the Iranian people, explicitly condemning what is ostensibly Israel's unprovoked act of war and aggression against another sovereign country. I think we have to be very clear about, number one, what happened. We have to be very clear about the ideological stakes at play in this context. And three, we need to get out there and mobilize. A lot of people are out there mobilizing. We've just seen an unprecedented wave of protest for this No Kings movement, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing what Aimé Césaire and many others have identified as colonial boomerang coming to reap its rewards in the United States.
As the Marines get deployed to LA. Yeah.
As armed forces begin to disappear people in the United States, I think people won't continue to tolerate that status quo. It's my hope that your listeners will take a step beyond domestic policy, beyond, the horrific policies of DHS and ICE and all these organizations, to see that all of these struggles are interconnected and interlinked in ways that are not immediately evident. That the suffering of people in Palestine, the suffering of people in Iran is not necessarily the same struggle, right? But it's linked. And that linkage is what I'm trying to, what my work is trying to do, which is to raise awareness that if we are really going to bank on a humanist, rights-based approach to global governance and order in the wake of an event like the Holocaust, we really shouldn't be laying the foundations for it to happen over and over again.
Absolutely. I think another, and also an important point in this as well is to take advantage of the recent memory of Iraq, because I think general consensus in the US at this point is that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake. There are still neocons that will still go to bat for it and whatever, but generally most people seem to realize that it was a mistake, that we were lied to about weapons of mass destruction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why is that any different than now? We're literally watching the same playbook be pulled out here. It is so, like, it's startling just how similar it is. And I think pointing that out is effective. This is the same script. The American Empire has a script of what it does when it wants to invade somewhere, and we're doing it again. We are afraid of a weapons program. We are afraid of this is all the same. And so, as we mobilize to connect these issues, I think making no compromise with anybody who supports an invasion with Iran, anything like that, and making it clear that this is not something that we want to, that anyone on the left or just your average everyday U.S. citizen does not want to support. We're done with these imperialist wars, and would hope for more diplomacy. Regime change just doesn't work. Forced regime change just hasn't worked and isn't going to work.
Absolutely. And the most interesting thing, the last thing I want to point out, I don't know, you can splice this out if you want to, but the right in the United States is not this monolithic force to be reckoned with, right? The right is just as fractured, just as broken institutionally, conceptually, as the left appears to be. If you want evidence of this, look at the debate that just happened between, of all people, Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz.
Right.
Where Tucker Carlson, I don't, he's not on my list of heroes, to put it mildly, right? But even he can see that these forever wars are a continuation of what President Eisenhower warned about, this military-industrial complex that seeks to make money through the institutionalized murder of human beings. It's not leading to flourishing. It's not leading to, so what do we do with that? Well, we need to work on dismantling it. We need to work on working together to invest in our communities. And it sounds very pie in the sky, liberal nicety, but, living in Michigan, you drive 20 minutes outside of the city, things are falling apart to a degree that I have not seen before. This country is falling apart by the seams.
Yeah. I mean, I could just speak anecdotally to the job market's the worst I've ever seen in my lifetime right now. I mean, I consistently see all these ways in which everybody's quality of life is slowly eroding here. And so we don't need another war. Yeah, no, I think that's an important point, though, because this is one of the very, very tiny silver linings of the paleocon ascendancy that's kind of come of the last decade, is that the neocons are out of, they're out of favor even among the right now. It's it's become increasingly clear that the U.S. cannot spread democracy via intervention. Even among the most racist of right wingers, it is becoming more and more apparent.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Well, is there anything you want to plug or anything before we wrap up here? You're doing a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah, only to say that I have deleted my Twitter for reasons that your listeners might be sympathetic to. You can find me on Blue Sky, just Keanu Heydari at Blue Sky, whatever the handle is. I have a website. You can keep up with my shenanigans and my antics and publications on there. And yeah, thank you so much for having me, Josiah.
Yeah, this was great. I'll have to get you back on sometime for a not depressing reason. I need to. All right. Hey, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps out with the algorithm, helps people find the show. And if you really like what you heard, consider supporting the show on Patreon. And one of the benefits of supporting this show on Patreon is that you get your name read out at the end of every episode. So without further ado, this episode was brought to you by our lovely patrons who include Avakai Brodigam, I Drink Corn Syrup Yum, I Am Once Again, Leo Zachary Dickinson, Philip Cozy, Vita Breva, Alex, Attention Francis, Caleb Butler, Derek Hale, Gavin Aronson, Josh Christensen, Kyle Gannis, Moss, Nathan Thiessen, Please Don't Read My Name Out, I'm Shy, Randy Sutton, Regular Sized Horse, parentheses, Small, Robert Eilman, Stephen aka Spike Stonehand, The Worst of All Possible Worlds, Vicky Sutton, Mitchell McKinley, and of course, Chris Barker. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and I will see you on the Patreon later this month.